So we just had one or two problems here. So lessons learned at Webnographer about rolling out to lots of users. Main reason for this talk is we suddenly noticed that there's a lack of scalability talks about Grails. And the thing is that if you want to be cool, there's a lot of scalability talks, yeah? But there's actually kind of a reason why there's a lack of scalability talks. Scalability isn't an issue with Grails, but the talk is still important to actually do, because there's still a lot of lessons that one can actually learn. So the one advantage is it does get you to come to talks like this. Okay, I'll wait for people. Okay, just settle a tiny bit. Okay, so to talk about Okay, so to talk about scalability, first of all, I'm going to talk a tiny bit about Webnographer so you can actually understand why we could have a scalability issue and why we get nervous about it. And then what we've actually done or what we haven't done. And I actually think one of the important lessons we learned is the less we do, the better. The more fiddling one does around, the more likely you are to crash. And it's interesting, there's a bunch of other startups that we know that have got a serious amount of scalability issues. They've gone for setups with things like MongoDB, and they're falling over. In the meanwhile, with Grails, we seem to be surviving quite well. We have an issue that the way our application works, we sometimes get DDoS'd by our own clients, but that's another story. So, if I just take you a tiny bit about what Webnographer does. We did two things at the company. We got this Popup, which is our clients put the Popup onto their web pages to intercept, to try to discover why people are visiting their sites. Now, the thing with this is that when their pages get hit, we get hit. Every single request that Webnographer gets is that our clients get is a request to ourselves. So the reason why we have millions and millions and millions of users coming to our site every month is because we got some very, very big clients. They get lots and lots of traffic. And it happened pretty quickly. We also do remote usability testing, but there isn't any scalability issues there. So we're based in Ireland and Portugal, just down the road. We got clients like Vodafone, British Telecom. We've worked with people like the BBC. And what we really try to help clients do is optimize their purchase funnels and try to understand why people are visiting their sites. And I'm just taking these slides from another presentation, so I'm going to go through them very quickly. But we basically try to discover why users are lost. And the way we do that is by doing one of these pop-up boxes. Yeah? So we intercept a user and we say, please, we take this survey. And because of the large scale of the clients, that creates a lot of traffic for us without necessarily the fame or when you kind of like hear about the cool kids on the block, everybody's heard of them. But with us, we've suddenly had to scale quite large without coolness or any of that. And the really surprising thing is how little that we've actually had to do. And I actually think that's part of the key to the success is that we haven't that we haven't done lots of fiddling, that we haven't got a complex stack. But I'll go more into details in a second. And I think the other thing is that if you look at a lot of these large companies that are actually becoming quite big, as you look at somebody like WhatsApp that had 250 million users, they only had 25 developers. GitHub, they've only got about 50 developers there. Yeah? So the important thing of scaling isn't necessarily, there's two things about the scaling issue. Is one, can you do it in a very highly productive manner? Yeah? Do you need, the larger your stack is, the more specialist knowledge that you need to gain. And keeping things very simple, trying to keep things very bare bones, it's amazing how much you can actually scale. Yeah, I've got the image by accident got in there. Okay. Now, my personal thing about scaling things is back in 1997, I launched a site called deckchair.com on British morning breakfast television in front of 9 million people. Our back end was using an IBM 360, which is a big, gigantic mainframe. And IBM at this time said, you can hit it with anything you want, yeah? It's big iron. This is a big machine, yeah? Guess what happened? We brought it down. And we brought it down, and we didn't bring it down once, we actually brought it down several times. And there was quite a big issue because my business partner was a singer called Bob Geldof, who's famous for I Don't Like Mondays. And what would happen was he would keep complaining about the IBM mainframe. Whenever he did that, that became a news story. And then the IBM mainframe would crash again because of all the traffic that suddenly started hitting the site. About. So it's always been kind of like an issue for me. If I build something, will it suddenly fall over at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the morning? Will it cause me great embarrassment? So you want to kind of protect against these issues. And there's also enormous danger of premature optimization. I've got these friends of mine who kind of like, they want to go the full scale, they want to go Node.js, they want to go Mongo, they want all this cool stuff. And the big challenge, they seem to be having scaling pressure at quite low traffic levels. Meanwhile, we seem to be at quite high traffic levels and don't have scaling issues. And I really think it's back to keeping things simple and not optimizing things until the last minute, until we really need to. Okay. Now, every startup, that's a big overgeneralization. Everybody wants a scaling issue, because if you've got a scaling issue, it means you've got lots and lots of visitors, doesn't it? Yeah? Now, I'll go back to the old question. I deliberately not reference Rails in here. But we have this thing whereby the Rails guys did two things. One was actually create the great idea of make popular frameworks, but they also came up with a lot of quite clever ideas, like bringing the whole lean thing in, the no rework, the minimum viable product, always working code. All of these things are really, really, really great to actually steal for the idea of scalability. I mean, the one that we have to keep reminding ourselves is minimum viable code. Yeah? Don't overcomplicate something which really, really, really doesn't need to be complicated. I mean, the other really important rule that we've got on knowing if we've got a scaling issue is we're very big in eating our own dog food at Webnographer. We use our own stuff. Does everybody know what this means? No. Okay, so eat dog food comes from Microsoft. Steve Ballmer, who was the CEO of Microsoft, came from the pet food industry. And in the pet food industry, if you're in the marketing, you eat the dog food. You eat the product. Everybody tries it. And what he was ashamed of was that nobody at Microsoft. So he created this thing which is everybody had to use their own products. And everybody, when they're developing an operating system, they actually write the code on that operating system as soon as they possibly can, and so on. So, I mean, we always try to think as many different ways that we can actually use our own code. How can we actually Another one that we really try a lot on is how can we fail very fast early? Where are our risks there? Which means really trying to like deploy as quickly as we possibly can. So we try, I mean, it goes back to the always working code. One of the biggest metrics that we keep an eye on is how many days was it since we last put a build on. So we'd like to be no more than 2 or 3 days between a bit of code being written and a bit of code actually hitting the infrastructure to see, do we actually have a problem? That goes back to also the releasing often. The no rework is really, I mean, that really comes from the Rails guys, but it basically just says, try to do things right the first time. You're not always going to succeed, but really make an effort to make really nice, clean code and not to fail there. Now, the pop-up that we've got that you saw, we get about 2.5 million visitors per month. When our customers get a request, we get one too. Each request is dynamic. The pop-up can be totally different depending on the client, depending on the browser, depending where the visitor is actually coming from. And we've had to roll out, and if we have a problem, our clients will be picking up the telephone and really complaining about us. Some of what we've done is tried to minimize what can go wrong for our clients, but that's another talk, really. Okay, so our infrastructure is actually one live machine at the moment. So we can easily take 2.5 million visitors off the back of one machine. And I think the real simple thing here is we've tried to keep it as simple as we possibly can. By only having one live machine, it means only one thing to monitor. It means there's not some complex model that can go horribly wrong. And the way we do it is we rotate stuff around. So one live machine, then when we put a new build on, we just change machines. The old live one becomes the hot spare, and so on. And one of the important things is being able to recover very, very, very fast from something going wrong. We had a big issue, I don't know, 3 months ago, because our clients were trying to stress test their own site. And they were, of course, doing this really nastily. They were doing it at 3 o'clock in the morning on Saturdays. So every 3 o'clock on a Saturday, we would fall over. And I mean, the way they're stress testing, there's a great Portuguese phrase which is called doing stuff for the Englishman. The amount of stress that they were putting their own infrastructure in was completely, I mean, it was more visitors hitting their site than there were people in the world. I don't know what the tests actually showed, except everybody fell over. But the important thing is when we collapsed under that load was that we were very, 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 very fast to switch over to our hot spare. And this is one thing that we've actually had to kind of like gear ourselves up with custom scripts to really know when one's falling over and when to actually to do the fall over. And I think this infrastructure is far better than trying to work out how to actually spread the load between 2 machines. We're soon going to have to be doing that. I mean, if this talk was happening in 2 months or 3 months' time, we will have to kind of like spread the number of machines out because we're nearly reaching the limit on one machine. And these machines aren't expensive. I mean, we're paying less than 100 euros per month per machine. So, and talking with people, I think it's a lot more efficient and a lot simpler than using a Linode infrastructure or Amazon Web Services. Yeah, I mean, this is just saying it's bare metal, it's not cloud. And they're also distributed, they're in each box is in a different country. And the real plain thing of this is we really are just using Grails out of the box. We've done some tiny micro optimizations. I mean, some of the stuff we do is quite database intensive, creating some stored procedures that create some summary tables. But that's it. I mean, everybody would actually recognize the code that we're actually running, and it's just straight out of the box. Talking to everybody else I know, they're all trying, I mean, their stack is really complex. And yeah, we do need to know about Hibernate. Yes, we do need to know about MySQL, SQL code. But the great thing about Grails is it really takes a lot of care out of that. Yeah, a simple stack and simple infrastructure. Basically, there's 3 scaling strategies. One is bigger hardware. The other one is more hardware. And then the other one is reduce, which is more optimal code. And I'm going to just take everybody through what our thinking is there. Okay. So, okay. So bigger hardware is really this, for quick, easy scalability. But there's a limit to how far you can actually scale on that one. And at Webnographer, I think we've actually got to that stage now. And I think the point that I'm really trying to make in this slide is that it's not until you get to stage 3 that you really should be looking at trying to look at the stack and other forms of optimization until you get there. So bigger hardware. And then the second one is just spreading out. So it's actually separate databases and move the static stuff to a content delivery network. Does everybody know about CDNs? No. Which just distribute your static images all the way across to different servers that are onto the edge. At the moment, because most of our traffic is in Northern Europe, it's coming in from Germany, it's coming in from the UK, we haven't bothered yet using a CDN or even separating stuff out. I mean, our infrastructure that we're using is really just using Jetty on the front end. Jetty's serving our images just as much as it's serving our, the Grails requests. And I think the reason here is it goes back to the whole deploying quickly and fast. If we suddenly had to have several different builds actually going on, one for the static, one for the Grails, then our whole deployment infrastructure would be a lot more complex. And remember, we're only 4 people. So with a team of 4, you need to kind of like keep everything into one place and not having it spread around. So you can do things like separate the database onto a second machine, but then you actually lose some speed onto that issue because you're going to have network latency. And then it's not until you get to the third step that you really need to think about optimizing code, looking at other kind of like caching strategies and stuff like that. And also looking at stuff like, is this code necessary? We did an enormous thing that when we started, there's an enormous tendency of thinking, wow, there are all these plugins that we can possibly install. Yeah? And we went a tiny bit mad on the number of plugins. And the problem is just maintaining the plugins, knowing where the plugin's been updated, knowing is it going to give me a performance hit. So about a year ago, we reduced the number of plugins that we're actually running all the way down to, I think, 2. We're about to add a third. But now we really, before we put a plugin in place, we really think, is this plugin really needed? Is the person maintaining that code actually know what they're doing? Are they going to give us a performance problem? Are we going to have, and are they going to keep maintaining it? Because one of the issues that we had before was people not maintaining plugin code. And yeah, we really got a performance increase by actually bringing back on board the code that we actually needed. And did we actually need that code onto that whole side? So it's reducing, I mean, it's really kind of like thinking optimal code. Can I reduce the number of requests to the server? And stuff like that, all the way before starting to go to the thing of more machines, and even things like optimizing the JVM. I mean, when we've had real problems, so it's actually, I mean, the problem with scaling Grails here is that it is actually very unsexy. Something to shout home about. Okay, so then the other thing that's really, really important is to measure. Web analytics really just tells you the number of visitors. It's a lot of what we call a vanity metric, which is, hey, I've got 2 million users. How many million users do you actually have? Far more important is actually knowing, have you got problems? Where have you got the problems? And there's very few tools actually geared to really spotting these things. We've tried looking at some other stuff, but things like missed pages. Can you spot somebody clicking something and then the page actually not being delivered to that end user? That's a real good sign that your site's actually falling over by the number of load. Are you tracking things like 500 error codes? Trying to spot where you're actually having problems, where are my users actually doing the performance things? I mean, one of the things that we keep seeing is people spending a lot of time doing unit tests, but then when stuff actually gets deployed and it hits the real world, it's really, people don't, the behavior is completely different. You know, where people are clicking, what people are actually doing. And unless you create some kind of instrumentation of what's actually going, and the way we've done it is actually inside our code, which is probably not the best way. I mean, this is probably a really good place for somebody to try building a plugin for doing. And it's when you come across an error, an issue, is actually keep asking why. What's actually happening here? Are there I mean, we had one issue once whereby it's just really lazy code, is one request was being bounced around on redirects. So the poor end user was actually being redirected about 10 different times all the way through. And this was a tiny bit of code. It was a bug fix that somebody released. Nobody noticed it, yeah? Until the code changed somewhere else. And it's not until you actually have a way of actually controlling for this that you can actually optimize for, what's it called? For scalability. And I think this is far more important than trying to, what's it called? Trying to have the best scaling infrastructure that you can possibly do. I mean, I may be being exceedingly naive here, but I'm pretty sure that the infrastructure that we're running at the moment, our end users are getting a good experience and it's not collapsing. But you've got to keep asking yourself, are my users actually having a problem here? Okay, so. And I think actually where we're going to go into the future is actually a lot more exciting. We're starting to play around with Docker. Is everybody familiar with Docker here? So Docker's really quite cool. It gives you a bare metal. It's not a virtual machine. Somebody else should give a talk on Grails on Docker. But it basically allows you, the developer, to set up a machine that's exactly the way it will go in production. And you just move the Docker it's basically you build images, and it's a stack of images, and you configure it to how you want it to be. And it will help us a lot in deployment, which is really, really important, because fast deployment and always eat, and it falls back down to eating dog food. What you're developing on will be exactly the same as what's actually going to go into production. And then the other thing that I think is really exciting of actually just taking off the load off the center is the way we're moving into the Ember.js and Angular.js, where we're moving from developers being a full stack, so doing stuff end to end. So me as a developer building both the JavaScript and also the back-end stuff. And where we're going with the the web apps is stuff moves into the middle, and we can let the JavaScript guys just focus on their stuff sitting in the browser, and we can concentrate on the back end. And that really moves a lot of pressure and performance pressure off the center. So, I mean, half hope at Webnographer that we can move quite a lot of our analytics stuff onto the web app side, and that will take pressure off the center. And it means, yet again, we don't need to go from kind of like having multiple servers in the middle. I mean, we basically are fighting every single step of trying to not have more than one server live at any one time. Even though it would be really cool if we kind of had a big ops room with all of that in the front. So the full stack will further take pressure off us. But I mean, it boils down to the whole thing of scaling Grails is boring. If you want something more fun, you should choose another infrastructure, another web framework, whereby they're actually having problems and actually scaling, or you've got something like Node, whereby they're battling constantly of getting the number of instances up. Okay. This kind of it. If anybody wants to come, they should come along. They can always come and visit us in Lisbon, which is just down the road. It's a bit hotter there. Just bring it into questions from the audience. So, anybody got any questions?
Your application nature is completely stateless.
What?
Is the nature of your application stateless?
No. Yeah, it has to be dynamic. So a lot of what gets the pop-up changes its state depending on the browser, the country somebody's coming from, often even like the adverts that they may have seen. So we may be running like a different questionnaire to somebody who's seen a Google Mail advert. So it's actually having to answer quite a lot of questions. It's also coming very late in the process because we have to wait until the DOM is actually fully loaded until that actually happens. So, I mean, I'd love for it to be stateless. Yeah. Because I think there's a lot of people who talk, hey, we're managing to roll Nginx out to millions of people, but Nginx is, you're not running something that's very dynamic. And there's one cheat that we did do, and it wasn't nice in Grails, which is we have got some stored procedures running, which kick in to try creating summary tables to try making some stuff faster. But they're kept to a minimum. Yes?
I'm curious, what two plugins do you use, and what was the third one you ran?
What?
What two plugins do you use, and what was the third one you're planning on?
We're switching. Okay, so one of the problems that's been with the plugins is like keeping up to date. So one of the things that we're doing at the moment is switching from the old security one over to Grails security. So we're ripping out. Yes, we're ripping that out and we're replacing it with Grails security. What?
You're currently using a CQ?
No, we're using, yeah, Shiro. So we're switching those two over. And that's been the least bit of fun that we've actually had with it's actually been things like switching from one plugin to another plugin. and then we had some other issue. We had enormous problems with the resource plugin. And that's actually been, the sad bit, that's where most of our headaches have actually been, has actually been when either stripping plugins out, or actually when there's been a bug in the plugins, dealing with them.
Yeah, I think asset pipeline makes it a lot better.
Okay. We were looking at that. And we're really desperate to keep code together. Not yet. I know people who are, and they seem to be doing quite well. So there's all the warning signs that you're not meant to use it in production, but I think we're tempted. We would do quite well in using it in production. I think we'd use machines a lot more efficiently if we actually did. I mean, we want to use, if we go back to here, oops, okay. Don't try doing it the other way around. If we tried to, I mean, where we would really like to have is a lot more machines on the staging side. So, about to go live. And would like to kind of like deploy stuff to staging multiple times a day, and then roll them back out. And if we, I mean, Docker would really help us there. Is anybody here using Docker in production yet? No. But I think Docker, yeah, Docker looks and should be very, very, very cool for our stuff. Yep.
You mentioned that you were planning to use instrumentation.
What?
You were planning to instrument everything.
Yeah.
So, how do you plan to do that? Are you going to, I don't know, expose JMX endpoints for instrumenting your code, or maybe another kind of monitoring?
I like dumping, I'm probably very old school on that. I mean, JMX we've done some stuff with, but I'm a lot more likely to kind of try to dump something to a raw file that we can then look at. It kind of like one of the slides that, I mean, when a machine's under a lot of load, it feels like arrows are constantly hitting at you. And you're having to kind of like fight these arrows coming at you. And sometimes just knowing what's actually going on is very, very, very hard. A lot of the tools that we've tried to use off the shelf have been near enough useless. You have a question that, I mean, you go there and you've got, okay, this tool doesn't help me. Okay, I see these pretty pictures of its screenshots. I'll download yet another tool to try actually understanding what's actually going on. And then you kind of like find out that the resolution, I mean, I must have wasted 2 weeks of my life playing around with round-robin databases. And the problem was that the database deletes it. Does everybody, okay, so a lot of the old Linux tools store information in what's called a round-robin database that basically it cleans itself out over time. And you have a lot of resolution over stuff that happened a week ago, and then stuff that happened 2 weeks ago, and stuff like that. And it was a real hair pull out, and we could never actually identify what actually was happening, because by the time we actually worked out how to get the tool to get the information out of the tool, the information had been deleted. And then we could never replicate. And that I mean, that's one of the reasons why we're wanting to instrument a lot more, is the difficulty often in replicating. And it's the most frustrating thing. You know somebody's having an issue, but there's nothing you can do to try to replicate it. And that becomes a problem. Yep.
What kind of caching are you using?
We're just using straight out of the box EH cache.
But no kind of from caching like varnish or anything?
No, not at all. Okay, so this is on the Popup, we're not. On the remote usability tool, it's got its own caching built into it. And we've actually got a problem with it that it actually often, does far better than what's it called, than the client's actual sites. But we have noticed things like people installing things like the Google tools, what's it called, Speed. Does anybody know what the Google's Speed? Yeah, and they've actually run slower with the optimizations in them than without the optimizations in them. And that becomes quite a big issue, I think, for some people. That the whole problem of putting the Google tools on is that it complicates the code so much that nobody actually understands what goes on, and therefore nobody can actually optimize it. And I think that's the boring part, is that the simpler you keep things, the better they perform. And have you used front-end caching at all, like Varnish or?
Yes, but one of the problems that I found is if you have a very dynamic site, figuring out which bits to cache and how is difficult. So sometimes it's not easy just to optimize just that dynamic site rather than trying to cache it.
I did one, I mean, this is years ago, I did work for a site everybody will know of, which is Al Jazeera. And they went from being an unknown site to suddenly being the 10th most popular in the world. And they had this really complex ASP content management system that would just fall over. And what did we use? It was before Varnish. We'd put the standard Linux proxy and we would just reversed it. And that worked very, very well, but it wasn't very dynamic. I mean, Squid. And it was brilliant. I mean, we suddenly got a site that's constantly crashing to one that was performing very, very well. And we could probably optimize our code a lot more than we actually are at the moment. And I mean, has anybody, I mean, here had scaling issues with Grails? Yeah, okay. What happened?
Session, it's a classic Java thing, the session. Using flash scope is encouraged to do.
Yeah.
If you use flash scope, then suddenly you've got massive scalability. Because you have to have an in-memory session, so you have to manage that session or have some session factors or something. So getting rid of the session is the trick.
Yeah, we don't actually, okay, that is actually one thing on the pop-up that we're actually doing. It's not actually, it's creating a session, but only a session at the last possible moment. So when somebody actually sees that pop-up box arriving, no session's actually been created. It's not until, that is a bit of hack code. When people click the button, that is when it actually sends an AJAX request that then creates a session back onto the Grails application. And that's the way we actually do that. So, and it isn't causing us a problem at the moment. And that was probably premature optimization, which was lucky. Yeah. So it's, and so what, you just got rid of flash scope, or?
Yeah, they've been using flash scope, trying to reduce the amount of sessions, eventually removing the session completely, which is quite hard to do. Once you've got rid of sessions, you can scale out very, very easily.
Well, we haven't got rid of it. We just got rid of it on certain requests. So, yeah. But probably go back, so you're going for pure kind of like, so there's no session between requests at all? Okay.
Which is, I mean, it makes it easy. It's easy to make faster. You don't have to scale. Well, scaling things becomes very simple to add to the box. And you don't have to worry about maintaining the session if something fails. All of that thinking just goes away. So I like it, but it does make it code hard because you can't use things like flash stuff, which is a nice thing.
And security, how do you deal with that?
Well, that's one of the things. Often it's sometimes code when it gets refreshed. Essentially, you have to use a database, all the time, which adds an extra database hardcore for being able to scale out. That was a decision we made. It worked, but it was a bit painful.
and then just using a cache for the session. I mean, I've always been nervous about the flash, using the flash, which is probably the reason why we may have survived.
Yeah, well, that was kind of the problem with it. Using the flash scope, it's a very nice thing, and it's very, very nice and easy to use. And it's suckers you in, and suddenly you find your site alive, and that just prevents scaling.
And anybody else having scaling issues, or 2 minutes? Okay, last. Anybody else having scaling issues, or yeah? What happened?
We have a lot of physics, so we have to denormalize all our data because we have a big amount of data, and internationalization issues as well. So we have to denormalize everything, and we are using like kind of patching in British.
And I would look at one thing that we did that did improve things a lot, if you're looking at denormalization, was stored procedures, which are very untrendy. Okay, I think that's it. So thank you very, very, very much.